It's December 14th here in Seoul, and I'm Kim Dami. We begin with these stories making the headlines at this hour. Starting with President Yoon Suk-yeol's state visit to the Netherlands. The South Korean leader and Dutch Prime Minister Mark Rutte officially adopted the term semiconductor alliance in their joint statement. The two sides are hopeful that their collaboration will maintain a so-called super gap in chips. The Federal Reserve kept interest rates steady for a third meeting and gave its clearest signal yet that its aggressive hiking campaign is over by indicating 3/4 point cuts in 2024. Over in Dubai, COP28 eventually wrapped up with no agreement on phasing out fossil fuels. Instead, for the first time, countries agreed on the need to, quote, transition away from fossil fuels and energy systems. President Yoon Suk-yeol and Dutch Prime Minister Mark Rutte set out ways to increase bilateral partnerships in key strategic areas, most notably in the area of semiconductors. Now, this came at a joint press conference on Wednesday, following their talks during Yoon's state visit this week. Our Oh Soo-young breaks down the joint statement.
South Korea and the Netherlands have agreed to build a semiconductor alliance and new strategic dialogue channels amid the conflation of global security and economic challenges. President Yoon Suk-yeol and Dutch Prime Minister Mark Rutte on Wednesday shared the outcome of their bilateral talks at The Hague upon Yoon's state visit to the country. As the global race to develop the most advanced microchips continues to heat up, given the technology's implications on a nation's economic and military prowess, Yoon and Rutte committed to building value chains between their governments, firms and universities.
한국과 네덜란드 간의 반도체 동맹을 구축했다고 하는 것은 저희들이 반도체의 그 초격차를 유지하고 최첨단의 기술을 함께 구축해 나가기 위해서 저희들이 중요한 과학 기술적인 문제들에 대해서 함께 논의하고 해결하고 정보를 긴밀하게 공유한다는 그런 뜻입니다.
Officially adopting the term semiconductor alliance in their joint statement, the two sides agreed to establish a bilateral semiconductor dialogue for better industry support and policy coordination, and a semiconductor talent program to nurture professionals in the field. Also, they set out to promote more information exchanges between their governments and establish a new economic security dialogue, along with a biennial 2+2 dialogue for foreign affairs and industry officials at the ministerial level to cover all critical technologies.
This is expected to greatly contribute to strategic coordination in the areas of supply chain, economic security and export control, including semiconductors.
Identifying both traditional and emerging security challenges, the two sides also inked a deal to expand defense cooperation and continue cyber policy talks and advance global discussions on setting new norms on the military use of artificial intelligence. Further broadening the areas of cooperation, having upgraded their bilateral ties to a strategic partnership last year, the two governments inked MOUs on joint research and development in nuclear energy, carbon-free energy sources and ICT, in the digital AI, quantum and cybersecurity sectors. Other major deals include building South Korea's first cold chain logistics hub in Europe, as well as R&D on neuroscience and smart agriculture, and promoting cultural exchanges. Looking forward, the two leaders emphasized their shared values of liberal democracy and rule of law as the basis of their future partnership. In that regard, they reaffirmed their commitment to peace and prosperity of the Indo-Pacific region, which sees some 60% of the world's maritime trade pass through, and jointly condemned North Korea's nuclear and missile development. They also opposed the regime's arms exchange with Russia, while expressing their continued support for Ukraine amid Moscow's ongoing invasion. The President's office says South Korea will continue to bolster its security and economic resilience by expanding its network of like-minded countries, fostered by Yoon's active summit diplomacy this year. Oh Soo-young, Arirang News, The Hague.
Also in Amsterdam, President Yoon underscored the deep roots of history that the two countries shared. From the Korean War to the Second World Peace Conference at The Hague, the underlining theme was peace, justice, and freedom. Our Kim Do-yeon has the details.
At the Royal Palace of Amsterdam on Wednesday, President Yoon Suk-yeol met with around 20 Dutch Korean War veterans and members of their families. He also showed gratitude for the swift decision by the Netherlands to support the South during the Korean War.
우리 정부와 국민은 70여 년 전 공산 침략에 맞서 싸운 네덜란드 청년들이 흘린 피를 결코 잊지 않고 그러한 감사의 마음 위에 양국의 굳건한 연대가 지속되어 오고 있는 것입니다.
More than 5,000 Dutch soldiers were deployed to South Korea during the war and more than 120 died. They participated in a number of key battles, including in Inje, Gangwon-do province. President Yoon also took the opportunity to award a, quote, hero's uniform to a 93-year-old Dutch veteran. King Willem-Alexander also showed his appreciations to the war hero.
Just as our country received help from the United States, United Kingdom and Canadian forces during World War II, 5 years later you went to South Korea and fought for freedom. Even now, 70 years later, you are still receiving expressions of gratitude from South Korea.
The historical connection between South Korea and the Netherlands dates even further back. President Yoon, in fact, while at The Hague, visited the Ridderzaal, where the Second World Peace Conference was held in 1907.
President Yoon, together with Prime Minister Rutte, viewed exhibits related to the 1907 World Peace Conference and paid tribute to the patriotic spirit and noble cause of the national heroes.
Korean diplomats, led by Lee Jun, were dispatched to the conference to speak up for Korea's sovereignty amid Imperial Japan's attempts to colonize the peninsula. However, the diplomats were not admitted to the conference due to rejection by Japan at the time. President Yoon is the first South Korean president to visit the site, and he explained to Prime Minister Rutte why the place has special meaning for Koreans. After the visit, President Yoon also paid a short visit to the Ijun Peace Museum. There, the top office says President Yoon took a look at the room Ijun stayed in while making efforts to spread the word about the unjust occupation by Japan. Kim Do-yeon, Arirang News.
The Federal Reserve held interest rates steady for the third consecutive time, laying the groundwork for highly anticipated multiple cuts in 2024. Now, those cuts would bring the Fed's target interest rate closer to 4.6%. Our economic correspondent Shin Ha-young reports.
During the U.S. Fed's last meeting of this year, policymakers on the Federal Open Market Committee decided to maintain interest rates for the third consecutive time. With the Fed's latest move, the benchmark interest rates in the U.S. now stand in the range of 5.25% to 5.5%, marking a 22-year high. The decision is largely attributed to robust employment and a slowdown in inflation. The Consumer Price Index, a key gauge of inflation for last month, rose 3.1% on-year, the lowest increase since June due to a drop in energy prices. Consumer prices have been slowing after hitting 9.1% in June of last year. The U.S. has been grappling with inflation, leading to a series of rate hikes over the last year and a half. On Wednesday, Fed Chairman Jerome Powell acknowledged that the current level is likely at its peak, but emphasized that it's far too early to declare victory.
While we believe that our policy rate is likely at or near its peak for this tightening cycle, the economy has surprised forecasters in many ways since the pandemic. Ongoing progress toward our 2% inflation objective is not assured.
The central bank has revised down its economic growth estimate for next year to 1.4% and also lowered the inflation rate to 2.4%. The interest rate is expected to tick down to 4.6% next year, hinting that the Fed may cut the rate by a quarter of a percentage point 3 times in 2024. Following the Fed's announcement, U.S. stocks welcomed the news. The Dow Jones Industrial Average on Wednesday surged 1.4%, closing at a new record high. The S&P 500 rose by 1.37%, while the Nasdaq closed with a 1.38% gain. Meanwhile, the latest Fed rate freeze means the key interest rate gap between South Korea and the U.S. remains at 2 percentage points. Shin Ha-young, Arirang News.
So the Federal Reserve wrapped up its last policy meeting of 2023 with another rate freeze and pivots toward cuts in 2024. For details, let's turn to Professor Kim Ha-gyun. Thanks for coming onto our program.
My pleasure to talk to.
Professor Kim, as widely expected, there has been yet another rate freeze, but we all saw it coming though, right?
Yes, it was rather anticipated. For instance, according to the FedWatch, which is the CME's computation of the Fed funds rate not changing or changing, the likelihood, and then it was over 99% about a week ago, so it was quite expected.
Right, and I want to point out how the central bank says inflation eased but remains elevated. What does this mean exactly?
So inflation now is around 3%, 3.1%. So compared to last year's like 9%, 6% type of the figures, clearly it's much more stable, which is a welcoming news. But inflation, as we know, is basically by definition the growth rate of price level. So as we experience like very significant increases in the last year and a half, the price is quite high at this stage. And unless we see negative inflation, we're not going to see this coming back down to lower levels. So that's actually what the Jerome Powell mean by the elevated.
Right, that must be in line with what he said himself, that the Fed doesn't need a recession to cut rates. Now, can we say that means there is a progress on inflation across all main core areas? Can we say that?
I think so. So according to the data, according to the last November's the releases all across the board, including core inflation or CPI, PPI, all seem very positive and meaning this much lower than expected. So I think significant improvement.
Right. What we did get out of Wednesday's meeting just hours ago is that there'll be 3 quarter-point cuts next year, but there's a divided outlook on when that will be. Some say as early as the first quarter of next year. Professor Kim, what's your outlook?
My outlook, I think, is mostly consistent with the first quarter of 2024, starting the first cut. The reason is inflation path, I think, has been stabilized. And I think it's going well into the direction of like around 2.5 or 2.2% next year. And the reason is at the end of the day, the money growth rate or supply of money changing speed is quite closely related to inflation at the end of the day in the long run. So we have seen the Fed balance sheet has been quite reduced, and also the banks, the balance sheet has been also decreased, meaning that the level of liquidity growth has been slower. So clearly inflation is going down. Given that, I think rate cut can happen as early as the first quarter. And also another reason, I think, is the spread between the long-term and short-term rate. So the treasuries actually is now negative, meaning the short-term interest rate is higher than long-term interest rate. The long-term interest rate, like 10-year, is around now 4%, while the short-term interest rate is around 5%. So somehow the market participants already started expecting that. I think it's going to go down to 4. So if the Fed actually started the lowering the rate relatively late, then I think there's some issues in terms of making the goal of lowering the interest rate successfully. So there's some non-trivial chance that the interest rate is going to go down a bit earlier than we expect.
All right, for sure, we'll have at least 3 quarter-point cuts next year. Is there any possibility that there'll be more than 3? What do you think, Professor Kim?
I think it's going to depend on the labor market. After all, the Fed's dual mandate principle is about inflation and then also the labor market stability. So right. If somehow the labor market is going, bad somehow next year because of this the high interest rate environment, then I think the Fed may just tap in the further interest rate decrease. That's somewhat expected, I think, in the yield curve that I just mentioned about the long-term, short-term interest rate, because the 30-year, 10-year interest rate actually is quite low.
Right. Speaking of the labor market, the Fed does believe the job market is finally easing into a so-called sweet spot. Could there be a turmoil in the labor market early next year? Do you think that could lead to a rate cut? What do you think?
It depends, because surprisingly, the labor market of the U.S. Was not affected much and has been doing really well, despite the very rapid increases in interest rates. So what the Fed actually initially worried about is the economy is not going down slowly, despite that interest rates going up very fast. But at the end of the day, if somehow the effect of monetary policy actually happened with lags, therefore, as you just mentioned, if somehow the labor market becomes deteriorated, actually even more than we expected next year, then I think the Fed is probably trying to go just lower the interest rate earlier and also more. But it's all going to depend on how the monetary policy and also the international shocks will affect the U.S. labor market in the next quarter. So I think the next quarter is going to be a very important focal point.
Definitely. Thank you so much for such a thorough analysis, Professor Kim. We appreciate it.
My pleasure, always.
Washington says a system for the real-time sharing of North Korean ballistic missile warning data between South Korea, the U.S., and Japan is expected to become operational within the next few days. According to National Security Council Senior Director for East Asia and Oceania, Mira Rapaport, on Wednesday, the three allies are on track to begin sharing of the missile warning data before the end of the year, as part of the agreement made during the Camp David summit back in August. Now, the data collected through the system is expected to enhance the three countries' overall capabilities to detect and track incoming North Korean missiles. Israel's Foreign Minister Ali Cohen said Wednesday that it will continue the war in Gaza with or without international support. The comments by Israel's top envoy comes as the UN General Assembly overwhelmingly adopted a resolution calling for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza. U.S. President Joe Biden also stressed that Israel was losing global support because of its indiscriminate bombing of Gaza, his strongest criticism of the armed conflict. Cohen added that a ceasefire at the current state of the conflict would be a gift to Hamas, as it will return and threaten Israelis again. After intense negotiations, the COP28 climate summit in Dubai came to a close. It produced the first ever climate deal with language on fossil fuels, but called for a transition away rather than a phase out of oil, coal, and gas. Lee Kyung-in reports.
A historic climate deal. Nations at the COP28 climate summit in Dubai agreed on transitioning away from fossil fuels. It is a first for a UN climate conference to produce such a deal, though it still stops short of including a long-demanded call for a phase-out of oil, coal, and gas.
We have language on fossil fuel in our final agreement for the first time ever.
The final consensus came after COP28 was extended beyond its official closing time of midday Tuesday due to intense overnight negotiations over the key sticking point, whether the text should include a call to phase down or phase out fossil fuels. Along with the final text transitioning away, nations also agreed on commitments to triple the capacity of renewables and double energy efficiency by 2030. Other progress was made in adaptation and finance, including the operationalization of the Loss and Damage Fund to support countries most vulnerable to climate change. The UN and EU largely celebrated the deal as a milestone achievement in global climate action.
I think this is a global turning point. For the first time, the world is committing to transition away from fossil fuels. So this has the potential to be the beginning of a new era, the post-fossil era.
They are a climate action lifeline, not a finish line. Now all governments and businesses need to turn these pledges into real economy outcomes without delay.
The decision also satisfied oil producers like Saudi Arabia, who've been advocating reducing carbon emissions rather than fossil fuel phase out. But it left island countries that are facing the direct impact of climate change dissatisfied, as well as developing countries that raised issues of equal responsibility. Lee Kyung-in, Arirang News.
Good morning, I'm Kim Xiang, and now we turn over to stories from around the world. We begin today in Ukraine, where Russian missiles hit the capital Kyiv, injuring at least 53, with no reported deaths so far. The airstrike early on Wednesday morning took place as Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky left the US after seeking additional military support. At around 3 a.m. local time, 10 ballistic missiles launched from Russia were picked up by Kyiv's air defense system. The Ukrainian Air Force said that the Russian missiles were all intercepted, but the debris landed on residential areas, including a children's hospital. Kyiv has been constantly receiving drone attacks recently, and this was the third missile strike on the capital in the past week. Meanwhile, Zelensky is struggling to convince reluctant American lawmakers to pass a $61 billion military aid package for Ukraine. Now, moving over to Thailand, where a member of parliament was sentenced to 6 years in jail on Wednesday after being found guilty of defaming the monarchy. Rukshanok Srinok, commonly known by her nickname Ice, has been released on a $14,000 bail pending an appeal under the condition she does not repeat the offence. Srinok was charged with violating Article 112 of the Thai Penal Code and the Computer Crime Act for 2 tweets critical of the monarchy in 2021 before she joined the Move Forward party. The party won in Thailand's elections this year and has been urging for the reform of the country's strict lèse majesté law. She will lose her seat if she is imprisoned. The American electric car maker Tesla is recalling more than 2 million cars in the US market after the US regulator found its driving assistance system, autopilot, to be partially defective. This recall applies to any model with the autopilot feature, which was launched in 2015, meaning it affects almost every Tesla car in the US. The National Highway Traffic Safety Administration's 2-year investigation has led to the conclusion that there may be potential misuse of the autopilot function, which may hinder the driver's safety. Tesla acknowledged that the current autopilot controls may not be sufficient to prevent driver misuse, potentially escalating crash risks. Tesla's owner Elon Musk has since announced that the issue will be fixed by a software update sent over the air. Finally, the 2024 Paris Olympics organizers have announced that 60% of food at the Games will be vegetarian options. On Tuesday, a sneak preview was released for the chefs involved to showcase some of the dishes, including a burger with patty made from wheat. The organizers said that they will also aim to make 80% of all dishes from domestically sourced ingredients in an effort to reduce the Games' carbon footprint. A total of 13 million dishes are expected to be served at Paris 2024.
Good morning. The unusual December weather pattern continues with heavy winter rain this time. It has already started to rain in northern parts of Gyeonggi-do, Gangwon-do, and Chungcheong-namdo provinces. Rain that started in the west will spread nationwide by the afternoon, seeing more than 120 millimeters of showers in the east of Gangwon-do. The rest of the country could see up to 80 millimeters. Central parts of the country will see 10 to 20 millimeters an hour of heavy rainfall tomorrow. Concerns are rising for mountainous regions in Gangwon-do province, where already heavy snow has hit, and more than 30 centimeters of snowfall could be seen there. Morning temperatures are 3 to 7 degrees higher than the same time yesterday, and figures should stay above the norms today as well. Seoul topping out at 9 degrees, Gwangju at 14 degrees Celsius. On and off precipitation continues through Saturday, then midwinter temperatures sweeps much of Korea with frigid air. That's Korea for you, and here's a look at the international weather conditions.
We thank you for watching New Day at Arirang. We'll be back tomorrow for Friday's edition at the same time, 9 a.m. Korea time.